Hey, what's up guys? Thanks for stopping by the channel. So in this video, we're going to be checking out the latest dive watches to come from the Whitby Watch Company. And if you're not familiar with this micro brand, they are based in Whitby, Ontario, Canada. That's not too far of a distance from where I actually live. And I do want to thank Roy and the entire Whitby Watch Co team for lending in two of their divers for this review. So in one hand, this is the Ad Mare Arctic diver here, and then in the other, we have the Ad Mare Atlantic. Now, Ad Mare does actually have some Canadian roots. It loosely translates to something like from sea to sea, and I do think that this Arctic and the Atlantic color options do draw inspiration from the Arctic and Atlantic shorelines, so that's kind of a cool touch. And at the time of recording this video, there's still a bit of a sale going on for these watches, so I'm going to link to the Whitby Watch Co. website if you're interested in checking that out later. But for now, why don't we flip the camera around and you guys can actually take a closer look at these Ad Mare dive watches in the studio. So now that we're in the studio, we can take a closer look at this Arctic or Atlantic Ad Mare dive watch from the Whitby Watch Company. Now I would like to mention, if you purchase any of these timepieces, it comes in a very robust Nanook Pelican style case that's made in Canada. It's waterproof and a very robust way to store your watches or even travel with them, and I think it's a great addition to the overall package. Now with respect to the watches themselves, they're going to be very similar with the case design, which is done in full 316L stainless steel, as well as have the same stainless steel bracelet. They do have some subtle differences with respect to the color options and some of the features on the dial, and I'll try and cover that throughout the course of this review. But in general, for specifications and dimensions, you have a 44mm case diameter here. Flipping the watch to the side, you can see the case is actually quite complex and very robust. I get 50.7mm lug to lug between my thumbs right here. Case thickness is 13.8mm. That is from the bottom of the screwed down and nicely embossed case back, and then to the top of a flat sapphire crystal, which does carry anti-reflective treatment, so good viewing angles of the dial here. The lug opening for the supplied bracelet is 22mm at the head of the watch. This bracelet does taper down to about 20 before you get to the Whitby Watch Co. signed clasp. It's a fold-over security mechanism. Twin trigger release to some milled swing arms here. Overall, the clasp is actually quite short. There's only 3 levels of micro adjustment, but that being said, it's low in profile and fairly comfortable to wear on the wrist. So why don't I give you guys a quick in-studio wrist shot of both timepieces, just so you get an understanding of how it wears. So here's how the Arctic Ad Mare diver wears on my 7.5-inch wrist. That's 19 centimeters in circumference if you want to use the metric system here. And here's how the Atlantic Ad Mare diver looks on my 7.5-inch wrist. Now these do give you some wrist presence because of that 44mm case diameter, and sized up to my wrist, it's got some heft to it. This weighs in at 205 grams. But of course, you can also throw this guy on a strap if you'd like, because it does have a 22mm lug opening. Okay, so let's transition over to the Blue Atlantic here, and I'll go over some of the nice features for this style, and then I'll switch back to the Arctic model. So with this color option, you get a very nice dark blue colorway, and then you can see at the center of the dial, you got a nice wave motif pattern, and then as you extend out towards where the applied indices are, it's a slightly raised portion to the dial. You have nicely polished and silver surrounds on all of the applied indexes, a 3 o'clock date position, which has a black date disc, so it's not color matched to the dial, whereas on the Arctic, it's actually the same white color, which is a subtle difference. Very nice handset to these divers. It's a partially skeletonized sword style hour and minute hand. And then the seconds hand is slightly different on the Atlantic here when you compare it to the Arctic. You have a needle styles seconds hand with a red tip to it, and then a very cool half moon counterbalance to the seconds hand as well. Both watches do have a nice applied Whitby Watch Company logo just below the 12 o'clock position. And there's a 200-meter water resistance rating above a 6 o'clock. They actually test these watches to 300 meters when they assemble them here in Canada, but they rate it at 200 on the dial. Around the 6 o'clock marker, you can see Swiss movement. Both watches do run a Swiss Sellita SW200-1. That's a 26 joule movement. You get about a 38-hour power reserve, hacking, hand wind, and it beats away at 4 hertz. Operation of the movement can be done through the Whitby Watch Company signed crown, which is flanked by nice crown guards. It's a nicely knurled crown, which is screwed down, obviously, to give you 200 meters of water resistance. In the open position, you can manually wind the movement, and then if you pull it out to the intermediate position, you can quickly cycle through the date. And then if I do pull out the crown all the way, you can hack the balance, stopping the seconds hand, and then you can set to any reference time that you want. Both watches have a very nice chapter ring. With the Atlantic here, it's a very nice light blue color, and you have your running minutes track around that. And I think that's a really cool touch. Overall, the Atlantic does have a bit more in the way of pops of color because you got the light blue chapter ring, you got the red tip to the seconds hand, and it's got more of a glossy or shiny finish overall. The ceramic bezel here is a bit more glossy than the matte finish on the Arctic version, and both of them have 120 click unidirectional bezel action, which is actually turns very well. Each individual click is fairly precise as well. And then it does line up, although you do get a bit of wobble there. Now transitioning to the Arctic dial. This is a stark white dial, similar white wave pattern in the center of a dial. And then as you get closer to the applied indices, you can see it's partially raised. The chapter ring for the Arctic here, it's a little bit more subtle, but for most of the running minute markers, you have a pop of orange, as well as an orange seconds hand that's slightly different from the Atlantic. You can see it's kind of got like an arrow with a lume pip as you get close to the edge of a dial. So this one does have a little bit more lume when you compare it to the Atlantic. I will say the lume on both watches is actually quite good using C3 Super Luminova, but with the Arctic here, you're also getting a fully lumed ceramic bezel insert, which I don't even think Whitby Watch Company put for their marketing materials, and that was kind of a cool feature to have. One last cool design feature, which I don't normally cover in too much detail on my channel, is the embossed caseback. This is probably the coolest caseback that I've seen all year, and it's very Canadian. What you have is a motif that contains a polar bear, an orca, and a puffin that basically covers land, sea, and air for the Canadian wildlife out here. So if I'm going to have any constructive criticism for these timepieces, in general, I will say that they are kind of large. I mean, these are 44mm dive watches. The previous Whitby Watch Company diver, the Intrepid, was also 44mm, and I think that the consumers and market might demand a more compact diver in the future, maybe like a 40 or 41mm, so that's something that they could consider. And then, if I'm being honest, not a huge fan of the OEM bracelet. The links don't articulate very well. I mean, you can't really fold it flat over the case back. This first link past that solid end link doesn't move much. And the links themselves are only held in with split pins, or like those cotter pins that you just push out. At this price point, I would have liked to see solid screwed links, and then also maybe lengthening the overall clasp, adding some more micro adjustment, or potentially even a diver's extension. But at the end of the day, again, huge fan of the design of these watches. I know Whitby Watch Company puts a lot of Canadian focus when they're considering designing new timepieces. And at the time of recording this video, and you consider currency conversion, these guys will run you about $650 US. Now that is kind of a competitive price point when you're looking at micro brand dive watches, but I do think that that is worth the asking price. But as always, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comment section of this video. What do you guys think of the Ad Mare divers, and would you be looking to pick one up in the future? Now, if you do enjoy this content, please consider subscribing to the channel. It does help me out a lot. And as always, I can't wait to catch you guys in the next video.